remember the exact weight of the silence the night I found out. It sat on my chest like a black stone, warm from his breath and impossible to swallow. My name is Alice. I lived in a flat that smelled faintly of coffee and old books, filled with the small artifacts of a life I had built with Mark. Our matching mugs, the chipped plates he pretended not to notice, the spine of the same novel we'd both read at opposite ends of the bed. He taught me which beers he liked. I learned to laugh at the right places. That familiarity was the honey that made the sting of betrayal so much sharper. His name is Mark Reynolds. He was handsome in the practical, tired way of men who work with numbers for a living and joke in the mornings to soften the day. He was kind in the domestic ways that mattered. He warmed my hands on winter walks. He listened when I talked about trivial things. He remembered to buy my favorite milk. Everyone said we were a good fit. They never asked which parts of me I had folded away so I could be easy to carry. Lydia was a smear of lipstick in a photograph that appeared on my screen like something from a dream I'd never had. When I first scrolled through Mark's cloud, because I could not stop myself, because human curiosity is a muscle that always wants more, I saw her laughing with him in a restaurant neither of us had ever mentioned, their foreheads touching, a necklace catching the light between them. She had Mark's hand on the small of her back in a way I had never seen him touch me in public. She posted selfies on her account with captions about change and new beginnings. Her profile was the kind of curated intimacy people showed to make other people ache. I did not scream. I did not confront him that night. I sat on the kitchen floor in the dark, palms pressed against the tiled cool, and listened to the hum of the refrigerator like an engine that kept the world steady. I let the images replay, slow and unchangeable. The first moves of revenge are often thoughtless. A text sent in heat, a call to friends, a confrontation in a restaurant where the glass shatters and everyone has popcorn. But I did not want that kind of revenge. I wanted something colder, surgical. I wanted him to feel the precision of what he had done. Not just the shame, but the ripples that never stopped. I spent the next week like a diver mapping the contours of a shipwreck. I took small, careful inventories. Who was in Mark's office, what projects he was working on, which of our mutual friends favored him when he was charming and favored me when he was honest. I learned the password to his email because he saved it on his laptop and left it unlocked on the couch. A thoughtless mistake from the life we shared. There is a terror in that kind of access. It's like standing at the top of an open well and peering into a darkness you always suspected was there. What I found in his messages was a web of casual callousness that made my pulse slow into cold water. It wasn't just the physical affair. It was the little dismissals, the private jokes at my expense, the plans he made that never included me. He had been building a life with someone else in the margins. The thing about betrayal is that it always has a banal face. There was no cinematic betrayal, no thunder, no obvious villainy. It was laughter with someone whose name he typed with more affection than he had typed mine. In the beginning, my revenge took the shape of discovery. I printed photographs, ink smudges on cheap paper that somehow made the moments more permanent, and I wrote lists. Names, dates, locations, the tone of voice he used when talking about me in those messages. I made a map of his duplicity like a cartographer who has touched an infected corpse. Clinical, precise, distancing myself from the sickness. There was a part of me that wanted to tell him everything at once, to lay the photographs out like evidence on a table and watch his face collapse. But I had learned that such theatrics were food for drama, not for triumph. Theater gives the actor catharsis. It does not always give the audience justice. I wanted something that would last. I wanted him to understand not only that he had been found out, but that his comfortable habits had consequences outside his little bubble. So I began to build. Revenge, I discovered, is a craft requiring patience more than heat. There is an artistry in timing. I started with small recalibrations of our shared life, canceling subscriptions he used for work but only when the auto-renewal emails arrived, quietly rerouting a bill to his old address, changing the settings on our home assistant to respond only to my voice. Little things that whispered, someone else is steering the ship. When he asked about the missed meeting or the silent speaker, I smiled and said I must have fixed it. Technology is fickle, you know. He believed me because he always believed them. Minor inconveniences were something he could smooth over without thinking about why the patterns had shifted. But small fissures won't bring down a life built on complacency. The next phase required layers. Social, professional, internal. I began with the social, the easiest terrain. I arranged for a friend from university, Daniel, to message Mark about a holiday reunion none of us had planned. Daniel was someone Mark respected. He would not think to distrust the invitation. When Mark accepted in a single smiling sentence, he attached a photograph of Lydia in the message metadata, a leftover from a group conversation that was meant to be private. Daniel, aware and amused, sent it to a mutual friend. The photograph traveled in short, discreet hops through networks like a virus learning to survive. Within days, people who had known us for years were asking me awkwardly if everything was all right. I sat at brunch and watched them look at me with the gentle pity reserved for people with small, salvageable tragedies. I was careful. I curated the narrative they would carry. I did not scream, did not throw crockery. I spoke in those rooms, in an even tone, about commitment and how fragile it could be, letting my sadness act as a mirror in which others reflected my virtue. When people chose sides, they often chose the more honest tone, the person willing to be vulnerable. That was my first victory. People began to suspect Mark. But suspicion is ephemeral. It does not leave marks on resumes or contracts. For that, you need leverage. He worked in investment analytics, a world of numbers whispered behind frosted glass and bravado on company retreats. It was a place where reputations could be unmade by rumor if the rumor was accompanied by paperwork. I had access to enough to forge tiny inconsistencies, a spreadsheet with a misapplied formula here, a mistakenly invoiced report there. I learned, quickly and with a strange exhilaration, that you could nudge the machinery of a corporation with a carefully placed falsehood, and it would begin to adjust itself as if nudged by a wind. People upstairs would call, managers would frown, and Mark would have to explain things he did not expect to explain. Ethically, I know what I did was wrong. Even now, when I tell this story, there is an ache in my chest. But there is a crucial difference between explanation and confession. I was not content with making him feel small in front of colleagues. I wanted him to feel the splintering of identity. I wanted the life he had chosen to look inevitable, to be exposed as the hollow achievement it had always been. There were nights I lay awake cataloging every lie he had ever told me and fitting a new lie into its place, an infraction to balance a ledger. There were mornings I watched him leave and rehearsed the face I would wear when he returned home that evening, the face that would show nothing but the steady brow of someone who had lived through heartbreak and come out more exquisite for it. Lydia was a useful character in the play I was writing. She had the naivete of someone who had stumbled into complicity without viewing herself as a villain. I invited her, on the pretense of coffee, because cruelty likes to dress itself as courtesy, to the familiar bookshop he had loved, the one with the low light and the owner who knew me by sight. She arrived with a smile that could have been the caption of a romance novel, and sat down across from me with the obliviousness of the young and certain. I watched her hands tremble as she took a sip of tea. I did not confront her with accusations. Instead, I looked at her and let the silence become a kind of interrogation. "You must be Lydia," I said in the way people say it to those they will eventually forgive or dismantle. Her eyes widened. She thought she had been found out. She had been, but I wanted something more than a confession. I wanted to see the architecture of her rationalization, the scaffolding she had built to justify herself. She told me she loved Mark. She told me they were perfect together. She told me that I would understand with time. Time, I had learned, was a blade that cuts both ways. You can become better with it, or you can be worn down. I watched her through it all. Her social media curations, her small gifts to Mark that she posted as if offering them to the world. She represented the complacency I had once inhabited. She was the person I had hoped at one point to be. But the deepest triumph was not exposing them both to ridicule. That would have been petty. My aim was to pull the foundations out from under Mark's conviction that he could continue on without being fundamentally altered. So I drew him into the one arena he thought he owned: his sense of self. People like Mark build their identities out of consistent narratives. He was a loyal man, a professional, a steady presence. I wanted to show him, in daylight and in documents, that his narrative was not only damaged but fundamentally wrong. I began to leak small corroborated details to his firm. A conversation about ethics he'd had at a bar with a junior analyst. An email in which he dismissed a client's concern with a casualness that suggested negligence. These were not invented out of whole cloth. They were small truths he had left lying around, unguarded and naive. I presented them as part of a pattern. At first, they treated me like an errant ex, emotionally reactive, unreliable. But when the ledger of complaints grew and HR began to ask questions, Mark's calm evaporated. You can watch a person rearrange their face when the world does not match their expectations. There were meetings where he stared at the table as if the surface itself had betrayed him. I watched him explaining, stammering, trying to find his habitual charm. He was less convincing than I remembered. There is a moment, somewhere near the end of any long revenge, when you realize you have also been changed. I had imagined that when the truth came out I would feel triumphant, bright and freed. The reality was more complicated. I felt hollowed, not empty, but stripped of the soft human things that cushion us from the cold. I had become precise, like a surgeon who can no longer enjoy the smell of the hospital because it is the smell of their trade. He fought back, of course. Men like Mark have resources. He called mutual friends and painted me as vindictive. He accused me, privately, of manipulation and cruelty. He posted about privacy violations, about the unfairness of having his life unpacked. A few people sided with him. That stung in a different place. The human need to be understood to be not only right but also seen as having been right. Then something happened that I had not planned but, given enough pressure, felt inevitable. One of the analysts at Mark's firm, an ethical, quiet man named Victor, started to ask inconvenient questions. He had integrity for the sort that rarely survives the corporate treadmill. Slow, steady, and oddly contagious. He started compiling his own file, cross-referencing dates with a doggedness that made him seem like someone who had been waiting for the truth to be tidy enough to handle. When he presented the findings to compliance, the weight of his meticulousness broke through the noise. Mark panicked. I saw it in the way his emails multiplied, in his terrible attempts to explain, to distance himself. He made mistakes he never would have made before. Contradictions in timelines, misstatements about meetings, forgotten names. The more he tried to reassert control, the more the control slipped through his fingers like the fine sand of a dead hourglass. I could tell you that his collapse was glorious. I could describe the sharpness of his face when he realized there would be consequences that matched the scale of what he had hidden. But his ruin was not the end I needed. It was a moment, not a finale. I had wanted him to feel the isolation that comes when one's narrative fails, and he did. He watched his peers avoid him, called into an HR meeting where there were no comfortable smiles. His phone ceased to be a warm thing. That was the private justice I savored. Yet revenge has a way of laying bare a truth you cannot ignore. Hurting someone else, even when they deserve it, unravels you too. There were nights I woke with a taste of iron in my mouth, when the quiet of the apartment felt like a witness to all I had done. I began to see myself in faces I had not meant to see my reflection in, the owner of the bookshop watching me with an empathy that made me wince, Daniel asking if I was all right, Lydia crying into a pillow, not because she lost anything but because she realized she had been part of something larger than she'd anticipated. And then there was the final act, not of destruction but of reclamation. I realized, with a clarity that startled me, that the real victory would not be Mark's suffering but my freedom from needing him to be accountable in the specific way I had imagined. I wanted my life back in a sense that did not require retribution as currency. I wanted to be able to open my front door without expecting a threat behind it. So I made the most difficult choice. I let go. Not all at once, not with a dramatic monologue, but slowly, like dismantling a machine you once loved. I returned items he had left at my place. I changed my passwords and, this time, I meant it when I turned the lock. I deleted the drafts where I had rehearsed speeches and rewrote my future into something that bore my name alone. On the day Mark left, officially, in the sterile language of HR letters, I sat on the bench in the park and read the same book we had once read together. The pages smelled of dust and a faint lemon from someone else's perfume. The wind moved the leaves like a conspirator. Mark walked past, someone else's conversation in his mouth and hollowed eyes. He looked at me, and for a moment I thought I saw something like regret. Then he looked away. That was enough. People ask me if revenge changed me. The answer is yes. It sharpened me and then blunted me at the same time. It taught me that I could be both ruthless and tired. It taught me the exact weight of silence and the price of persistent attention. It taught me that winning is not always about the downfall of another, but about the construction of a self-sufficient life after the truth has been acknowledged. Weeks later, I ran into Lydia again. She was thinner somehow, as if the scandal had removed a protective layer she hadn't known she needed. She apologized, clumsy and sincere. I accepted. Not because I forgave everything, but because forgiveness is a transaction you make with yourself more than with the other person. This is not a story of triumphant bells and parades. There were no banners, no grand courtroom confessions. The revenge I enacted was a slow dismantling, a correction of the narrative that had been unjustly written. Mark lost his job, lost the soft warmth of his social capital, and face the kind of isolation that comes when one's story unravels. That was the justice I designed. And what of me? I moved my plants to a new window. The light was different there. Cooler and kinder. I learned to like my own coffee black. I began to write, mostly in the margins of notebooks, tiny stories about women who are both fragile and dangerous in equal measure. Sometimes, late at night, I thought of the honeyed way Mark used to make me laugh and the way those moments had been peppered with otherness. Sometimes I thought of Lydia and the way she had become my enemy without intending to. Revenge taught me one last thing. After you win, you are left to live with the architecture of the victory. You must decide whether to inhabit the house you have built from the ruins or to tear it down and tenderly cultivate a new garden. I chose the latter. If you ask me whether I would do it again, construct the patient, deliberate fall of someone I loved, I would answer in the quiet honesty that this era of my life deserves. Probably not in the same way. People make mistakes. Sometimes betrayal is a selfishness that comes from fear, not malice. But some things once done are indelible. The lesson that remains is not a blueprint for retaliation. It is an outline for the life I wanted to rebuild. One that belongs to me entirely, where my hands are not idle and where the small betrayals of the past are catalogued not as trophies but as stern reminders that I will, from now on, build my world with my own hands. I am Alice. I learned how to survive the unmaking of what I had thought was mine. I learned that retribution can be a cold compass, but that the true victory is measured not by the downfall of another, but by the way you go on living afterward. Lighter, stranger, and if you are lucky, wiser. After the HR letter, after the quiet that felt like a vacuum, life should have folded neatly into something tolerable. But closure is never a single act. It is a series of adjustments, small and insistently private. For a while I measured myself by what I had dismantled, by the ruin of his career, the way his friends' group thread went dormant, the way his name no longer invited the casual warmth it once had. That was a kind of proof, a ledger entry that read, "Justice, issued." And yet, files closed differently than wounds knit. There were new noises in the apartment, the scraping of a chair as I paced, the hesitant ring of my phone when someone called to check in, the way the radiator clanked like a distant heart. Triumph, I discovered, does not silence the lesser voices. It amplifies them. One evening, a month after the final meeting, I found an envelope slipped under my door. No stamp. No name. Just my name, Alice, in my handwriting, but not mine. It was a photograph folded in half, and when I opened it I felt the familiar old hurt like an animal at the back of my throat. The photo was recent. Mark, smiling in a cafe across town, his hand curled around Lydia's waist. They were conspiring in the tilt of their heads. The sort of photo that, once seen, keeps its light in your mind for a long time. I should have thrown it away. Instead I traced the edges with my thumb and felt something colder than anger, a pattern emerging again. Revenge is a fire that consumes what we feed it. I had thought I had walked out of the blaze, but the ember had remained, and maybe I had set it down among dry things. I decided then, that if this was a continuation of the story, it would not be one written by rage. I would not slip back into the old rituals of exposure. But some part of me wanted to know who had sent the photograph and why. Curiosity, that same muscle that had tormented me when I first scrolled through Mark's cloud, tightened. I started to investigate, not with the meticulous cruelty that had guided my earlier acts, but with something more tender, oddly parental, the need to set boundaries. I wanted to know whether this was an attempt to provoke me or a simple act of someone who had not understood what consequences lingered from the past. The photograph led me to an anonymous account, a nest of other images and small, jokey captions. The handle had the tone of a gossip page but with the intimacy of someone local. Whoever ran it knew where to stand to catch the candid moments. Cafes, parks, the edges of a gallery opening. They did not post everything. They curated the narrative as carefully as any influencer. But beneath the levity there was a current of malice. One-liners intended to sting, not inform. I could have waited for the account to tire or for Mark's new life to become stable enough that curiosity would let go. Instead I reached out. Careful, cautious, the way one makes a tentative step onto thin ice. I sent a private message under a false name. I saw the photo. Why are you doing this? I typed. My fingers steady. The reply was immediate. Because some people like to forget, it said. Because truth tastes better served cold. Because you deserve to remember. The cadence of the message was almost rhythmical. Calculated. I probed. The person replied with a riddle of details that could have been anyone. A neighbor, a disgruntled ex, someone who had once been hurt. They said nothing about motives beyond a thin justification cloaked as moralism. I pressed, and then they vanished. The account posted another photo. Mark and Lydia with a new friend. Their caption read, "New chapter. Cheers." I felt something like pity, not for them, but for whoever sat behind that screen cataloging other people's lives for sport. If my first revenge had been about destruction, this one had the shape of a mirror. I could have smashed it. Instead, I observed. It was around this time I met Camille. She was not part of the revenge narrative. She had freckles that gathered like a small constellation across the bridge of her nose and a laugh that spilled into the air and made things easier to breathe. We met at a language exchange. Somewhere people went to practice phrases and pretend the rest of their lives did not exist. Camille taught me to say the soft consonants in French. She taught me how to make a terrible tiramisu that, shockingly, came out edible. She had empathy in the way her eyes listened. It was not the fierce, all-consuming connection Mark had offered, and it was not meant to be. It was a life anchor. Relationships after betrayal are strange experiments. You enter them with a scar and some defensive armor. Sometimes the armor is helpful, sometimes it becomes an additional weight. With Camille, I felt something I had not allowed myself to feel. Small, ordinary joy. We would take walks along the river and count the blinds on the row of apartments across from ours. We argued about classic novels in the way two people with the same passion argue. Loudly with laughter. There was sexuality but also space. It allowed me to remember how it felt to be seen without having every movement analyzed. And yet, the anonymous account kept posting. It escalated, not into overt threat but into an intimacy that felt invasive. Images of Mark leaving the building at night with a coat hooded, photos taken from angles that suggested someone knew the rhythms of his comings and goings. Once, a photograph of me at the bookshop appeared. My hands over a cup of tea, a page turned in the book I had been reading that afternoon. The rational part of me had to acknowledge that the account was not only childish. It was an unsafe sort of attention. My previous tactics, leveraging corporate machines, nudging reputations, felt distant and cold when applied to this smaller, more insidious harassment. This required a different arsenal. Boundaries, legal counsel, surveillance turned inward to protect rather than destroy. I filed a report. The police were polite and mildly skeptical. Harassment online had a way of slipping between practical definitions and human discomfort. They took my statement and assigned a detective, a woman named Kasia who wore sensible shoes and a look that suggested she had seen many patterns before and recognized ineffable ones without drama. "We will look into it," she said, and I believed her in the measured way you believe in a bridge. Not with blind faith, but with hope backed by structure. At home, I changed the locks again. Camille stayed the night sometimes. She left plants in the windowsill and a dish towel with a ridiculous pattern. Her presence did what my earlier schemes had not. It made the apartment a place of continuing life, not only of strategy and defense. I began to write more, longer paragraphs that smelled like the interiors of new notebooks. Writing became an electrode. Sometimes it jolted me, sometimes it soothed. Then the anonymous account made a mistake. They posted a photo that included, in the background, a distinctive mural on a wall near my favorite station. It was a mural I had photographed before, a swirl of birds and cobalt that an artist had painted over the course of a week. The caption included a passing remark about watching the city change. But the detail was all I needed. I trailed their metadata, wove together the kind of forensic patience that no one else suspected I still had, and I found their pattern. Not their face, but their proximate area. A neighborhood. A rhythm. Kasia's team worked with the data. They drew lines and called in resources and asked questions that I had not thought to ask. They got a warrant to access the account's login IP, and technology, cold and implacable, did what human anger could not. The trace pointed to a small apartment across town, the same block where Mark and Lydia had once lived for a short, laughing season. It felt like an echo. When the detective sent an officer to the address, the door opened to a 20-something man whose hands trembled when he handed over his phone. He was thinner than I had pictured, with the tiredness of someone who had stayed up too many nights for the wrong reasons. He confessed to running the account, his voice like ripped gauze. He said he had watched us from the edges of social media, collecting images like trophies. He said he felt righteous, as if holding up a mirror to us would cleanse him of some private wrong. He cried in a way that was not a plea for mercy but an exposure of a truth. People break themselves against others sometimes, and the shards are sharp. There was a court summons. The anonymous feed was taken down. The man apologized in open court, the words wobbling. It was satisfying in a civic way. Justice this time, administered as law rather than ledger. It felt like a decent end for a small horror. I told myself that the pattern had terminated. An account closed, a file sealed. And yet, closure does not always move in a straight line. Life continued, in its odd slanting way. Mark's downward trajectory stabilized into a quieter sort of exile. He moved towns, found a new job at a smaller firm, sent occasional messages of banal regret that were polite but empty. Lydia kept her apartment and joined a creative co-op. Our mutual friends found new grooves, new jokes, new stories that no longer involved the three of us. Camille and I grew together in the modest, unsensational way of two people building a scaffold. We kidnapped my Saturday mornings for pastry hunting, and we built a ritual of watering our plants on Wednesdays. She read my drafts and asked questions that made my sentences stronger. She noticed when I tightened my jaw, like an old habit of vigilance, and she would take my hand and pull me back into a softer world. She was neither a cure nor a conclusion, just a companion who kept me honest. Sometimes, late at night, I would open my notebook and write about what revenge had taught me. I wrote that justice is not a line but a terrain. There are peaks of satisfaction and valleys of complicity. I wrote that you cannot recover every lost hour, but you can decide what to do next with the hours you have. I wrote that people change, sometimes in ways you wanted and sometimes in ways you did not. The act of writing felt like laying down one safe stone after another. On a cold morning months after the court case, I received a small package without a return address. Inside was a paperback copy of the novel Mark and I had once read together, the one that had lived on our shelf, its spine softened by time. A note was tucked inside, in handwriting that was not his. It read simply, "People deserve second chances if they learn to keep them." I did not need to know who had sent it. The gesture landed with a curious lightness. I carried the book to the window and read a passage aloud to the room, to the plants, to the light. Camille was in the kitchen, humming. The city hummed beyond the glass. For the first time in a long time, I believed that my life had more chapters than the ones that had been defined by someone else's choices. Revenge, I had learned, was a teacher that could be cruel and precise. It taught me to see patterns and to act. But its greatest lesson was not the fall of a man or the humiliation of an affair. It was the knowledge that after the dismantling there is the tender, often tedious work of reassembly. You repair what you can, you forge protections where you need them, and you sometimes allow room for new things to grow. I am not immune to resentment. It returns in small human ways. A flash of anger at an old song, a moment of doubt when an email goes unanswered. But it no longer dictates the architecture of my life. I have built walls that are secure but not fortress-like. I have learned the craft of living without needing to control every outcome. If the story continues, and of course, life insists on continuing, I will keep paying attention. Not as a judge, not as an avenger, but as someone who learned the value of boundaries and the fragile currency of trust. I will watch for the small signs that a life is being rebuilt honestly, and for the quieter ones that show a person is still pretending. There is a final image that stays with me. The mural near the station, the birds in cobalt, their wings cut against the concrete. Once they were a backdrop to a moment of my life where I felt small and exposed. Later they were simply part of the city's story. Bright, indifferent, persistent. I like to think of myself as more like those birds now. Not soaring all the time, but persistent. Able to lift, to glide, to keep moving. My name is Alice. I will remember what happened, not as proof of victory or as a litany of grievances, but as a map of what to protect next. My heart, my trust, my days. And if someday, I find myself standing again at the crossroads where betrayal and choice meet, I will choose, slowly, deliberately, what kind of person I wish to be. It took me almost 2 years to realize that revenge stories never truly end. They just fade into memory, into quiet echoes that stop rattling in your chest. By the time I turned 30, the world had shifted enough that even the scars felt like part of someone else's life. Mark had become a name I no longer flinched at. I heard, through a mutual acquaintance, that he had moved to another city, was doing some consulting work, and had recently become a father. The information landed in my mind like a pebble dropped in still water. A ripple, then silence. I didn't wish him harm anymore. I didn't wish him anything at all. That was the freedom I'd been chasing without realizing it. Lydia disappeared from my periphery entirely. Maybe she learned her lesson, maybe she didn't, It no longer mattered. The truth was, she had been a mirror too, one I no longer needed to look into. As for me, I had built something unexpected out of the ashes. I taught writing workshops, small ones, in local cafes and libraries. People came with stories of grief, loss, betrayal, and hope. I listened to them, truly listened, and watched as words helped them understand what time alone could not. It was strange, teaching others to turn pain into language when my own had once burned me hollow. But maybe that's how we heal, by showing others where the exits are. Camille was still there. Not as a savior but as a witness. We had grown together, through quiet dinners and imperfect days. There were no fireworks, no endless passion. Just presence. She once told me, peace is louder than revenge if you learn to hear it. I didn't understand it then. I do now. I still visit the park sometimes, the one where I last saw Mark pass me by. The trees have grown thicker, the benches repainted. Life, it seems, insists on renewal. I sit there with a coffee, reading the same novel we once shared, not to remember him, but to remind myself that I survived the unmaking of everything I was. When I finish the book, I close it gently. And I whisper almost to no one, it's over. Not in bitterness. Not in relief. Just fact. Because it is. That chapter of my life, his betrayal, my revenge, our ruins, exists now only as proof that I was capable of both destruction and rebirth. And if life ever tests me again, I will not reach for vengeance. I will reach for understanding first. And if understanding is impossible, then I will simply walk away, quietly, intact. Revenge taught me how to break things. Healing taught me how to build again. And somewhere between those two lessons, I finally found myself. My name is Alice. And this time, I win by living well.